Hello and welcome to this conversation today here on the internet. I am Kaveh Akbar, poet and professor based in Indiana at Purdue University, here with my good friend and hero, Mary Karr. How are you doing today, Mary?
I'm so happy you're doing this with me.
I'm so
Thrilling.
happy to be doing this with you, and I have this very cool big giant headset on to do it with you so that I
You look
can
like you look like a pilot. So get us off the ground, bro.
that's the idea, and hopefully I can get us off the ground and keep us in the air for a minute. I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to introduce Mary. Um, Mary once told me a story about the time she took the SAT. She was in the middle of the language portion when she got to a section of questions about a poem by the poet Howard Nemerov. The teenage Karr was so taken by this poem, she stopped taking the rest of the test and just kept reading and rereading it over and over again until she was confident she had it committed to memory. This, before the age of Google and Twitter, was the only way she knew she could keep the poem with her, to memorize it there on the spot. It's a perfect story because it's so quintessentially Mary. Rules be damned, consequences be damned. There was a bit of beauty there on that page, and she wasn't going to let it slip by. Mary is the author of several best-selling and award-winning memoirs orbiting her wild and truly unimaginable life, memoirs that catalyzed a revival of the entire genre and ushered in decades of new voices into our literary ken. She is also quietly an immensely talented musician, visual artist, and does tons of quiet and humble work for folks in recovery. But Mary has always been, first and foremost, a poet. Her newest collection, Tropic of Squalor, is divine and profane, demotic and holy. It's laugh out loud funny, irreverent, unforgettable. It's Mary in a nutshell. Mary Karr is the author of three award-winning best-selling memoirs, The Liars Club, Cherry, and Lit, as well as The Art of Memoir, also a New York Times bestseller, and five collections of poetry. She's received a Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships for poetry and is the Peck Professor of Literature at Syracuse University. Welcome, Mary.
Wow, thanks, Kaveh. I'm shaking pom poms at you quietly.
I'm always shaking pom poms at and for you. Um, Maybe a good way to begin this time together, which would have been corporeally held in San Francisco were it not for the current pandemic that has us all sort of trapped between our walls. But maybe a good way to begin this time together would be for us to read some poems to sort of season the air with the actual thing that we're here to discuss.
Why don't you go first?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, it's. I always do alphabetical.
Okay. That's very sweet. I will then read just two poems from. These are two newer poems, two poems from a collection that I'm working on. These aren't actually quite out yet, but I'll just read two quick poems. This first poem, when I was growing up, I was born in Tehran, Iran, but we moved to America when I was young, and then we spent lots of my early years in the American Midwest. And in the American Midwest, there weren't a lot of Iranian things, a lot of Iranian nouns, as you can imagine, especially not 25 years ago. And so there was this one Persian restaurant in Chicago, and every year we would go there once. We would take this like family pilgrimage, and we didn't eat out at all. We never went to McDonald's or anything. We just didn't eat out, period. And so this was the biggest deal in the world. And my brother and I would know in advance what we were going to order. We would like plan our orders so they would complement each other and all that. And so this is sort of an ode to this restaurant in Chicago and called Reza's Restaurant. It's still there. They have a lunch buffet now. Reza's Restaurant, Chicago, 1997. The waiters milled about, filling sumac shakers, clearing away plates of onion and radish. My father pointed to each person, whispered, "Persian, about the old man with the silver beard, whispered Arab about the woman with the eye mole, Persian, the teenager pouring water, white, the man on the phone. I was 8 and watching and amazed. I asked how he could possibly tell when they were all brown-skinned, dark-haired like us. Almost everyone in the restaurant looked like us. He smiled, a proud little smile, a warm nest of lips, said, "It's easy," said, "We're just uglier." He returned to his lamb, but I was baffled, hardly touched my qaymet. I had huge glasses and bad teeth. I felt plenty Persian. When the woman with light eyes and blonde brown hair left our check, my father looked at me. I said, "Arab?" He shook his head, laughed. We drove home. I grew up. It took years to put together what my father meant that day. My father, who listened exclusively to the Rolling Stones, who called the Beatles a band for girls. My father, who wore only black, even around the house, whose arms could cut chicken wire and make stew and bulged with old farm scars. My father built the world. The first sound I ever heard was his voice whispering the azan in my right ear. I didn't need anything else. My father cherished that we were ugly, and so being ugly was blessed. I smiled with all my teeth. That's my Rez's restaurant poem, and I'll just read one more.
Beautiful.
Thank you. And I'll just read one more. This is a new one. In Islam, the sort of precipitating miracle, maybe a sort of parallel to the virgin birth, the sort of catalytic miracle, is that the Prophet Muhammad was said to he was revealed the Quran as he was like sort of in this mountain, and he was an illiterate man. You actually have a poem in this book about, maybe we can talk about that, but he was illiterate, and yet when the angel Gabriel came and told him to transcribe, he was able to write. And so in a very real way, literacy is sort of like the bedrock miracle upon which all of Islam is built. So anyways, this poem is kind of orbiting that. It's called The Miracle. Gabriel grabbing the illiterate man, alone and fasting in a cave and commanding, "Read." The man saying, "I can't." Gabriel squeezing him tighter, commanding, "Read." The man gasping, "I don't know how." Gabriel squeezing him so tight he couldn't breathe, squeezing out the air of protest, the air of doubt, crushing it out of his crushable human body, saying, "Read in the name of your Lord who created you from a clot." And thus, literacy, revelation. He wrote. It wasn't until Gabriel squeezed away what was empty in him that the prophet could be filled with miracle. Imagine the emptiness in you, the vast cavities you have spent your life trying to fill with fathers, mothers, lovers, language, drugs, money, art, praise, and imagine them gone. What's left? You live in what you aren't, a house useful not because it's floorboards or ceilings, but because the empty space between them. Gabriel isn't coming for you. If he did, would you call him Jibril or Gabriel like you are here? Who is this even for? One crisis at a time. Gabriel isn't coming for you. Cheese on a cracker, a bit of salty fish. Somewhere a man is steering a robotic plane into murder. Robot from the Czech robota, meaning forced labor. Murder labor, forced. He never sees the bodies which are implied by their absence, like feathers on a paper bird. Gabriel isn't coming for you. In the absence of cloud parting, trumpet blaring clarity, what? More living. More money, lazy sex, mother, brother, lover. You travel and bring back silk scarves, a bag of chocolates for you don't know who yet. Someone will want them. Deliver them to an empty field. You fall asleep facing the freckle on your wrist. Somewhere, a woman presses a button that locks metal doors with people behind them. The locks are useful to her because there is an emptiness on the other side that holds the people's lives in place. She doesn't know the names of the people. Anonymity is an ancillary feature of the locks, ancillary from the Latin ancilla, meaning servant, an emptiness to hold all their living. You created from a clot. Gabriel isn't coming for you. You too full to eat. You too locked to door, too cruel to wonder. Gabriel isn't coming. You too loved to love, too speak to hear, too wet to drink. No, Gabriel, you too pride to weep. You too play to still. No, Gabriel won't be coming for you. Too fear to move. You too pebble to stone, too saddle to horse, too crime to pay. Gabriel, no, not anymore. You too gone to save, too bloodless to martyr, too diamond to charcoal, too nation to earth. You brute, cruel pebble, Gabriel, God of man, no, cheese on a cracker, mercy, mercy.
Those of you who don't know, Kaveh is one of my favorite poets. I fell in love with him on the page before I ever got to see his beautiful face. He has a beautiful chapbook called Portrait of the Alcoholic, which is just one of the, it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and Calling a Wolf a Wolf. The world tour he did for those books, the amount of missionary work he does for the art of poetry, he never isn't celebrating somebody else. So I'm going to start with reading, I guess I can't do that. I can do that. This poem that I happen to know Kaveh likes. So it's called The Voice of God.
Yeah.
And I'm a prayer. We're both prayers. Mm-hmm. And, when I first started praying, I was really waiting for that lightning bolt through the ceiling. So this is literally supposed to be the voice of God speaking to you. 90% of what's wrong with you can be cured with a hot bath, says God through the manhole covers. But you want magic to win the lottery you never bought a ticket for. Tenderly, the monks chant, embrace the suffering. The voice never panders, offers no 5-year plan, no long-term solution, no edicts from a cloudy white beard hooked over the ears. It is small and fond and local. Don't look for your initials in the geese honking overhead or to see through the glass, even darkly. It says the most obvious shit, i.e., put down that gun. You need a sandwich. This is called... I have a section at the end of this book of a bunch of linked poems. This is called Psalms. They're taken from the Hebrew Bible. Actually in the Greek Bible too. This is called Psalms, Carnegie Hall Rush Seats. Whatever else the orchestra says, the cello insists you're dying. It speaks from the core of the tree's hacked out heart, shaped and smoothed like a woman. Be glad you are not hardwood yourself and can hear it. Every day the cello is taken into someone's arms, taken between spread legs and lured into its shivering. The arm saws, and all the sacred cries of saints and demons issue from that carved cleft hole. Like all of us, it aches, sending up moans from this pit we balance on the edge of. I was gonna do maybe my only happy poem in this book. That's a joke. I'm friends with Phil Jackson, and have been since, I think, 96 we met out in Idaho it was a party for a bunch of writers who nobody knew who he was. And so he's just standing there with his big 6'8" self. And I had a 12-year-old son who was playing basketball, and I went up and hit him about belt level with my eyes and shook his hand and said, "Hello, Mr. Jackson. My name is Mary Karr." Also, the backstory on this poem, which is called Loony Bin Basketball, was about checking into a loony bin for suicidal ideation, which I did right after I quit drinking. I quit drinking, and then I realized why I've been drinking for 25 years. Loony Bin Basketball is about that game we played in custodial care. And this will be the last one I read. The gym opened out before us like a vast arena. The bleached floorboards yawned toward a vanishing point, staggered seats high as the Mayan temple I once saw devoured by vines. Each of us was eaten up inside, citizens of lost and unmapped cities. Frank hugged the pimply ball over his belly like an unborn child. Claire dressed for daycare in daffodil yellow and jelly shoes. David's gaze was an emperor's surveying a desiccated battlefield. Since he viewed everything that way, we saw him the same. The psych techs in Cloroxed white were giant angels who set us running drills at which we sucked. The zones we set out to defend were watery at every edge. We missed close chest passes, easy combos. Our metronomes run different tempos, John proclaimed. Then Claire started seeing dashes stutter through the air behind the ball, then speed lines on our backs, and then her own head went wobbly as a spinning egg. She'd once tracked planetary orbits for NASA, and now sat sidelined by her eyes' projections. Only Bill had game. Catatonic Bill, whose normal talent was to schlub days in a tub chair, his pudding face scarred with chicken pox, using his hand for an ashtray, belly for an armrest. Now all that peeled away, and he emerged clean as an egg. He was a lithe and licorice boy, eeling past all comers, each shot sheer net. He faked both ways, went left. Beneath the orange rim, his mid-air pirouettes defied the gravity that I could barely sludge through. He scored beyond what even Claire could count. Then he bent, panting, hands on knees, as the orderlies held out water cups, and the rest of us reached to pat his back or slap his sweaty hand. No one minded about the stench or his breath like old pennies. Then as quick as that, he went, inside his head. Some inner winch did reel him back from the front of his face where he'd been ablaze. He went back and back into that shadowed stare. Lucky we were to breathe his air. Breath is God's intent to keep us living. He was the self I'd come in wanting to kill, and I left him there.
It's such a staggering
For Action
ending.
Jackson. What?
It's such a staggering ending. That's such a staggering ending of that poem, and defying the air that I trudged to. What's the line? It's just an extraordinary poem.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I love hearing
Jackson.
you read too. Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, he's having a moment right now with the documentary. Yeah.
I talked to him a couple of days ago. I mean, he told me that Rodman just invited him to go with him to North Korea on an NBA.
Naturally.
Sort of missionary basketball event. Yeah, and I don't think he's going to be leaving Montana. It's just a guess.
Not to go to North Korea.
Not to go to North Korea.
Probably the best decision. It's extraordinary
Diet
to hear.
Coke.
That's great. Yeah, it's great. It has more caffeine than regular Coke.
That's what I'm into.
One of the things for those who haven't yet encountered the book, and I heartily encourage everyone watching or listening to this to go and do that, because it's incredible. It's called Tropic of Squalor, available at your local
of Squalor.
independent bookseller, and also everywhere else, but especially at your local independent bookseller. One of the sort of structural or organizational conceits is that the second half of the book is you're sort of rewriting your own version of the Hebrew Bible, or you call it the less holy Bible. Can you talk about that structure, how you came to that, and how you came to that mode?
Well, like you, I mean, we're both spiritual, religious poets. We're religious without being doctrinaire, I think of us. I think I just found these little poems that felt to me connected somehow, and I started moving them around. They just kind of, it was like they were iron filings that just sort of pulled in. I was writing them separately, and then I found them accruing into a place. And then I had this idea that it was a less than holy Bible that I was trying to create. And I began to write poems to fill in the gaps, that certain chapters I wanted to have. Petering.
Petering, that's good.
Petering. A poem actually about Isaac Babel, who's one of my favorite writers. So, like everything, it was a silly accident.
Like everything, it's a silly accident. That's beautiful. Well, I mean, there's almost
I love that refrain you had in your poem. Gabriel is not coming for you, but every time you said it, I felt a little thwack like an arrow in my chest. I was like, maybe he will.
Yeah, well, that's how I feel. That's how I feel every day. Certainly, someone is going to arrive and lift us out of this sort of muck, and but it's like your Voice of God poem. Oftentimes that someone that you're looking for to arrive isn't, arriving in the blazing saddle of a, winged horse, blaring their trumpet. Oftentimes that person is just an awareness within your body that it's time to take a bath or eat a sandwich, and that's the genesis of your discontent.
But I also love that you did that after the person was empty. And I think what's terrifying about meditation, which I've been doing, a medium shitty job of for 30 years, is that your first encounter with that emptiness is terrifying. Mm-hmm. It's always interesting to me, that when God shows up or when Jesus is resurrected, the first thing they always say is, fear not, because people are going like, ah!
Yeah. Yeah, well,
you don't want to see the glory. The glory is terrifying if what you really want is a pair of big knockers. And then you're faced with having to love everybody on earth, and you go, oh my God.
Yeah,
let's go back to the titties.
Even just figuring out how to love yourself is, a lifelong journey.
That's the hardest part.
Some of us, yeah. I find it, I find loving my spouse imminently, I can do that, quite easily. It's the loving myself, or finding love for people who frustrate me or vex me. There's a line in a Sarah Manguso book where she writes, it is by the about people whose behaviors she finds noxious or disruptive or aggravating. She writes, it is by the grace of this behavior that this person has found it possible to continue. And isn't that great? I
love that, but I always say that I can gauge my spiritual condition by whether I want an Uzi to mow down everybody in the subway. All I have to do is take public transportation, and I know immediately where I am with God.
Well, or like going through an airport, and I feel like people are on their worst behavior in airports oftentimes. They're just in their sort of least humane. If you've ever been pulled off a plane because you're, the flight gets delayed, and then the people just sort of screaming at the poor ticket agents, and da 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 da. It's pretty hard to find love for all mankind in those moments. How do you do it? How do you move towards that? Yeah, how do you move towards that?
Well, one of the things I've found to do is that I pray for the people I despise, or that I'm inclined to despise. I don't really despise anybody. I just don't have the energy for it. My demons are less vengeance or fury than it is irritation. It's so in the moment, I used to do a thing when I was in that very irritated state, and I still do sometimes. I was living in Hell's Kitchen though, and it was very jammed up right there by the Port Authority, and all the subways converge, and there's Broadway and there's Times Square, and everything's jammed in. I was in Hell's Kitchen on the further west side of all that. But when I was in those massive crowds, I would just say, Lord have mercy, on the lady with the Chanel bag. It's a hard sentence to say. Lord have mercy on the guy trying to park his Jaguar in that tiny space. So, but I do think that the most privileged people in the world suffer the torments of the damned. I don't think anybody gets off this planet without enduring a lot of blows.
Yeah.
Everybody has felt the foundation of their world shake.
Yeah. Yeah.
I almost got in a fight with a lady over social distancing.
You've got to tell us that story.
No, so I go to the CVS, and she came in right behind me, and she had her mask down. And if you live in another place, you don't have to be so. But here in New York City, where over 20,000 people have died, and my daughter-in-law is a nurse, and I babysit for them, so I take this. It's literally, I feel like I'm protecting her and protecting the people who go to the hospital. And the guy had to tell her to pull her mask up over her nose. And then she sort of let it slip down. And so anyway, I was standing in line to pay, and she came and stood right behind me, and there was no one else in the line. And I'm standing on my dot, and I say, "Excuse me, do you mind moving back 6 feet?" And she says, "Don't worry about it." I am worried about it. My daughter-in-law is a nurse. She's a breastfeeding mother. Oh, I see. You don't care about these people here who have to work here. You don't care about their health. It's all about you. And I finally just said, "Go get on your dot." And I think I looked so deranged by that point that she went and stood on her dot. But then later I prayed for her, and I thought, who knows what she might have cancer. Who knows what burden she's bearing. You just don't know how people are suffering.
Yeah, and that's the sort of inescapable thing of all of it is, you never know, whose sort of bad behavior is born of something that was or is currently being done to them, by the universe. And I think that one of the sort of great trials incumbent upon us as people who are striving to live rigorously empathetic lives is, or rigorously compassionate maybe is a better word than empathetic, lives, is to find moments of grace for those people. I think a lot about this idea of grace, and I think that maybe a definition for me is that grace is inherently undeserved, right? If someone deserves grace, then it's propriety, or it's, then it's politeness, or it's decorum, right? Or, I think that the definition of grace is that you haven't earned it. And certainly, my path to get to now, and, we've both written a lot about recovery and addiction and
not drinking. Yeah, exactly.
And not drinking. Yeah.
When you first stop drinking, surprisingly hard.
Yeah. They don't tell you that when they sell you.
That's right. We all quit. I quit a million times before I quit 31 years ago. But yeah.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's a great definition of grace, is that it's undeserved. I remember getting put in the middle of a long journey in first class for no reason. And I said to the guy, I don't deserve this. You should give this to someone else. And he said, none of us deserve the good things that happen to us. And I said, that's such a beautiful thing for you to say. I got tears in my eyes. I said, what's your name? And he said, Gautama. I said, like Buddha. I said, my name's Mary, like the Virgin, only different.
Yeah. Sometimes the universe isn't very subtle.
It's not subtle.
Yeah.
It's not subtle. But I also think we don't deserve the things that happen to us. Well, it's gone now. I had something better flew through my head.
No, that's great. I mean, I think that the path that we are on now is one of sort of, I mean, we meaning like as a species, is one of increasing certainty. It seems like people are very, very sort of certain about everything, and certain that, certain modes of retributive justice are right for, anyone who disagrees with them politically or ideologically.
I mean,
right?
listen, I'm as guilty of that as anybody. I don't
Sure,
care.
no, of course, me too.
Left
yeah,
or right. I mean,
yeah.
My friend Dooney, who's a Republican, is one of the most generous, kind, loving, charitable human beings I've ever known in my life. And, outdoes me gift for gift into the world every day. So, there is no, this tribalism we've fallen into. I mean, in a way, I think of the pandemic sort of the way that, they said about the Great Depression, that was the greatest generation, or, that went through the Depression and then fought the war. And I do think, even though I think by the way, God, I think it's a shitty system, I do think that the only way I ever really make a deep change is through suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody dies, your child is sick. Everything suddenly, all your values, all that scrambling and striving and trying to gets very simplified when you're faced with mortality. And even though I don't think God sent this like a plague to punish us or anything like that, I think there was a wet market where people were butchering animals clumsily, and then everybody got on airplanes. I do think that there is going to be, that we have the opportunity as a people, as a species, as you said, for great spiritual growth and change that could galvanize us and make us stronger and brighter. Change national values so that it's not all about the designer bag and the big car and the, whatever.
Yeah, I think certainly that there is an opportunity for immense sort of growth and structural change. I think maybe I'm not as optimistic about you that we'll actually sort of follow through on that. I think that, our track record as a species isn't great in that regard. But I worry. Yeah, I mean, I worry that people will just sort of bunker down and further into their sort of avenues of cruelty, or avenues of gotta protect my own ishness, but I think maybe you're more hopeful than I am, sort of broadly. I wonder too about.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, I'm older.
Maybe that's what it is.
So hope is a necessity for me because I'm closer to the grave than you.
Well, and you have a new baby in your life too, and
right.
Certainly we owe them. I have two very young nieces too, and I think often about how their sort of incalculable innocence is deserving of a much better world than the world that we're actually going to be giving them, and how to move in my living to make it incrementally closer to the world that this is all horizontal, this is something like the horizon that we march towards and at which we never actually arrive. But I think it's the marching that keeps us good, and it's the motion that keeps us good. And I just, I think that we're both trying in our work and out of it, on the page and off the page, to figure out how to take each next step.
I think you're more, you have a greater sense of, I think, social purpose. in general. And maybe your generation does. I think my son and daughter-in-law do too. I think my generation sort of started out that way, and then I don't know what happened.
That's interesting.
We wound up with all the money in the world, I think is what happened to us.
I mean,
it's never good to wind up with all the money in the world.
It's slowly happening to our generation too, I think. And then the next generation, it'll be the next generation's job to call us out on our sort of tomfoolery. Do you want to? I wanted to talk to you more about the specific poems in the book, and we were just sort of zooming into this big picture stuff. One of the poems that you read. One thing that I always love about your poems is that, in subtle but very, very deft ways, they're constantly kind of defying our expectations of what poems are supposed to do or what poems are supposed to sound like. And you have the one poem that ends on "from this pit we balance on the edge of" that you read, right? Which is a poem that ends on a preposition, which is something that we never are supposed to, and yet, and I think that was in the New Yorker, right?
It was, yeah. Good for me. Good for the New Yorker.
Good for lucky the New Yorker.
Lucky the New Yorker.
Yeah. But yeah, I thought maybe it would be interesting to hear you talk about rule breaking on the page. We've sort of been talking about in your life, and certainly your nonfiction has talked a lot about your specific, the specific paths of rule breaking that have led you to where you are now. But just that sort of rule breaking on the page, I think, is quite interesting that you do as well.
Well, I think I grew up in East Texas, which is in some ways, if I was able to learn the alphabet past the letter J, and it was a miracle. But it was literally I remember in high school I had to hitchhike 100 miles to get to a bookstore. There were religious bookstores that sold giant Bibles and stuff to put on your dashboard. But I grew up drenched in this beautiful idiom. My daddy would say, she's got a butt like two bulldogs in a bag. Which,
oh, Jesus.
Which was actually, he liked a woman with an ample backside, and that was a compliment.
Oh, that was a positive.
It was a positive.
Two bulldogs in a bag just doesn't seem as sculpted as, yeah.
But it's also, they were alive and fighting and sort of in it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to stomp a mud hole in his ass. It was violent, and it's raining like a cow pissing on a flat rock. That scans. And also you say that, and if you say a metaphor like that, and the reader, whoever's listening to you laughs, they've transgressed with you. Mm-hmm. So you've kind of gotten people in the boat with you. Mm-hmm. And it's not only a beautiful piece of poetry, raining like a cow pissing on a flat rock, it conjures a whole world in which cows piss on flat rocks, and people stand around to go, wow, that's like, there's a lot of force, coming from that.
Yeah.
So I think American idiom, which breaks all the rules, is by nature transgressive. I was good friends with Philip Roth the last 5 years before he died, and he used to call me Huck, as in Huck Finn, which, other than being a racist character, I was glad to be associated with Southern idiom. I say other than being a racist character, like that's a small thing. But I think ending a sentence with a preposition is a feminine ending, as they say. When you end on a solid word or a monosyllabic word like buck, that's like a nail at the end of it. But you end cliff we balance on the edge of. You kind of fall off the end, and it's considered a feminine. It's considered not butch enough, maybe, for our iambic drenched poetry. But that was what I wanted. I wanted something more spoken, and more idiomatic, more between me and the reader. The pit on which we balance, the edge of the pit on which we balance is just too, English professory.
Yeah, it's pinky in the air.
It's too pinky in the air. That's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love that. And I love what you say, too, about laughter. I mean, when you put a line from your father in the book and it makes someone laugh, I mean, psychologists have and anthropologists have studied laughter and, this phenomenon where if you're watching a movie with your son and daughter-in-law, you're much more likely to laugh out loud than if you were watching that same movie on your own, right? And this is because laughter is a social phenomenon, right? And anthropologists have speculated that it's because it's kind of a herd behavior, right? We laugh to signal amongness. We laugh to signal that we are, with members of our tribe, right? And so when you have, a very sort of demotic, colloquial idiom like, to bulldogs in a bag or two pit bulls in a bag, right? And it makes us laugh, right? You're sort of drawing the reader into your tribe, right?
That's right.
They're sitting alone in their room reading this book, but in their lizard brain, when they laugh out loud, their lizard brain is like, oh wow, Mary is a member of my tribe, right? Like and that's always struck me as really profound too, when say like, you're reading Dorothy Parker or Robert Hayden, who could be very, very funny.
Very funny.
And they make you laugh out loud, right? Then your lizard brain is feeling this sort of, trans ethereal connection, right, with someone who is not even. Yeah.
Or my colleague George Saunders, who is famous for being funny, but what no one ever talks about. A lot of students, because I teach with George, a lot of students come to Syracuse University to try to learn how to be funny like George. But what makes George's humor work is that he takes you always from there to a deep pathos, deep feeling, deep passion, compassion, usually to a place of a very large compassion. So it's an old dance move, but I'm happy to steal it if it works.
That's beautiful. Well, and you have a poem in this book called Illiterate Progenitor, where you say, my father lived so far from the page, the only mail he got was marked occupant, right? Which, is sort of, I read that poem about, the sort of illiteracy of the Prophet of Islam, right? And, but this idea that, even those who don't have the kind of sort of formal education that is legible to empire as being educated, right, can still have sort of profound wisdom and profound value, and can still establish profound connection within people is maybe a commonality between the things that we're talking about.
Well, I also, even though poetry is thought of as this hoity-toity art, it's an oral art, it's where religion comes from, it's where all ritual and everything kind of dovetails with the invention of poetry, as Muhammad knew. That I love that's the first miracle. I love that. In the beginning was the word.
Yeah.
So I never wanted to write something my daddy, who had a 6th grade education, couldn't understand. So it's not that I don't use references to the Odyssey or whatever. I just always try to put in the poem whatever a reader would need to know where they are. I just don't want anybody to have to go off the page, because then I'm lazy. If I'm off the page, I reach for the channel changer. Maybe that's just me.
That's well said.
Lazy as I am.
No, that's good. I think that we're in an immensely distractible age, and there are a lot of things vying for our attention. And so I think that if someone is giving you, their attention, which is our most irreplenishable, most precious resource that we have as human beings, right? Our time. You can get more money, you can get more whatever, but you can't get more time. You can't get more attention. So if someone is giving you that, I think that you owe them a measure of legibility, or Horace says a poem should delight and instruct, right? And I think
right, dulce et
that's everything.
utile, right?
Yeah.
Should
There
be
you go.
sweet and useful.
Yeah. It's beautiful. Well,
I also wanted to say how much I loved that first poem, that portrait of your father.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And of being a Muslim kid in a mostly non-Muslim place.
Yeah.
And how amazingly you conjured that that wonder. How do people know things?
Yeah.
How does my father know this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's funny because now, I can tell, I haven't been back to Iran since I was 2.5, and, I'll probably never be able to go in this lifetime because of a vast conspiracy of boring bureaucratic and political reasons. But I can tell now, like if I'm in a room full of, Middle Eastern people, I can spot the Iranians pretty quickly, and I don't know what it is exactly, but my father saying, we're just uglier, that always stuck with me.
That's so funny because I think of Iranian women as the most beautiful women, and they're just shocking.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I think that what he meant by the word ugly, it took me a long time to kind of unpack,
You bring us to that. You bring us to that over the course of the poem. The first moment, it's kind of shocking, and it disarms you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but I come to see what it means, what he meant over the course of the poem.
It's a really lucky thing to be read by you or to be heard well by you. You and I could talk all day, and likely will after this is done. But we have some audience questions. Yeah.
I know,
so
right?
I want to make sure to honor those, and some of them we've actually talked about. Someone asked, "How do you think about balancing humor with heavier subjects?" So I think that we pretty well.
Yeah. How do you think about balancing humor with heavier subjects? I think, I mean. The great gift of the household I grew up with, which was full of insane people, self included, and was, a place riddled with bullet holes, was how funny everybody was.
Mm-hmm.
My daddy told these amazing kind of exaggeratedly funny barroom tales that could keep you from beating his ass if he beats you shooting pool and won some money off you. But and my mother was great with a one-liner. I remember somebody saying to her at one point, because she was married 7 times, "I don't know how you could sleep with more than one man." And she said, "Well, ask your daughter." It was just like, "Oh, damn, mother."
Yeah. That's great. That's a great comeback.
But everybody and my sister's funny. Everybody in my family was funny. The dog was funny. The cat was funny. Everybody was funny.
That's lucky.
So I think it was lucky. And I think a lot of I was depressed most of my life, and that kind of dark, depressive humor, I think, kept me alive.
Yeah.
It gave me a buoyancy of looking 2 ways at things, right? And I do think it disarms a reader to. If they come close to you in that moment of humor, you have a real opportunity to make them feel something more uncomfortable. Like, we're not going to stay alive forever. And we listen to the cello in part to know that. I'm looking at these questions now. Mary, I've read and, of course, loved your book on memoir, The Art of Memoir, if you're interested.
Available at your favorite local independent bookstore.
Yeah, available at my local independent bookstore. Now that I have a second draft, what is really, really the next thing to do to get it self-published? Well, I mean, you can self-publish at any time. I usually did. Every word I've ever published, I've done so many drafts of. I mean, a second draft to me wasn't even... The first chapter of The Liars Club, I wrote over 9 months, which means I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. And I knew somehow if I could get that first chapter right, I would have a way into the rest of the book. So I mean, you can self-publish it anytime you feel like it, but if you want somebody else to publish, when people ask me about publishing, I always say there's one surefire way: learn how to write. And the only way that I know to learn how to write is to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I mean, it is true that you occasionally find a voice or a way of looking or a mode that gets you in the room with something you've been having a hard time writing about, right? You can have that breakthrough point of view or attitude or voice or language on the page.
Yeah.
But for me, all the hard work is in revision.
Yeah.
Here's one for you. How does your spirituality influence your poetry? Are they related?
Yeah. I think we've talked a fair amount about that. But one thing that I can say is that growing up, my first language was Farsi. My second language was English. But in my house, we also prayed every day in Arabic. And nobody in my household spoke Arabic. Nobody understood Arabic. But we had all memorized these prayers. I remember my dad teaching me these prayers when I was, 3, 4 years old. He had these like laminated sheets. And as I was learning to read English, I was also learning to read these sort of transliterated Arabic prayers. And so, and I would just stand there and sort of, there are the motions, and I would just stand there and sort of mimic their motions and try to make the sounds as best as I could. And I think from an early age, I sort of learned that, there was this magical language that if I spoke it earnestly and beautifully, and if I got close enough to the music of the thing, I could thin the partition between me and God. I could thin the partition between me and a divine, right? And I didn't necessarily have to have a one-to-one denotative understanding of what each sound meant, in the sense of a denotative meaning, because I felt it, and if I was feeling it earnestly, that meant I was talking to God, right? And I think that my understanding of what I'm doing in a poem hasn't really wavered from that idea, right? I mean, I don't have to understand one-to-one denotatively like I'm telling a story with a beginning, middle, and end, right? I just need to make earnest music spoken with conviction, right? And so I think that is the bedrock upon which my entire sort of creative practice is built.
That's so funny because, of course, we had no religion, and where I grew up, my mother was an atheist, my father was a atheist, kind of union organizer type guy, OCAW Local 1242, and for me, I memorized poetry the way you memorize those prayers. And the poets were like my first... when you were talking about that in your first poem, when you were talking about Muhammad saying, I can't read, and saying, he made you from a clot. It's so great. I was thinking that my first prayers were poems, and poetry was my first altar, and my first saints or bodhisattvas, or however you want to think of them, were other poets. I also think, we were talking earlier about virtue. Leslie Jameson has a wonderful line in her new book of essays, make it bleed, make it burn. I was swollen with virtue, where she's doing a sort of charitable act. And I think that self-consciousness about virtue that I can get, as bad as any church lady I ever made fun of, I have to be very careful with any kind of spiritual pride.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it has to be rooted in the fact that I'm created. Even if you don't believe in God, you can't deny that you were created. You did not will yourself into the universe. The universe willed you into being. I also wanted to say on this question, which sort of reflects an earlier one, how do you think about balancing humor and heavier subjects? I wanted to go back to that a minute and say, like in Liar's Club, when I wrote about being raped as a child, I wanted I didn't want to leave the reader with that. I wanted the reader to remember that I had grown up past that moment. I knew that a huge number of people are raped as children, women mostly, but also men, and sexually assaulted. And I didn't want to leave them in that shame and pain. And so I did a kind of sarcastic, funny thing where I thought of the guy who had done this, reading this after he was grown, and how he would know that even though I don't name him, that I remember. And he would have to know that this was written and that other people had read it. And I just but I do it in a funnier way than that. And I think taking people out of a dark moment, realizing, I wanted them to remember that I'm an adult writing this, that I'm not the child this happened to, that I grew past this moment and reclaimed my power. And this was not the defining moment in my life, certainly not even the defining wound by any stretch. So.
Yeah, well, you have that line in Tropic of Squalor where you say, "My favorite button is power," right? And that sort of subversion of the power there, right, is like, what this person thought they were doing to sort of undermine your agency and undermine your power, right? You're sort of reclaiming it in a way. Yeah.
There's a wonderful line in a Cormac McCarthy novel. Where someone, I think it's Blood Meridian, where some cowboy sitting around the fire says the other cowboy, to a guy they call the priest, I can imagine a world a lot better than this world. And the guy says, yeah, can you make it so?
It's always, the imagining is easy, yeah.
Yeah, it's but it's getting the power to make things so, right?
Yeah, it's like getting the what's the old, is it Aesop who talks about getting the bell on the cat, the mice all decide, we just have to get the bell on the cat, and then we'll know when he's coming up. Yeah. And it's like, who's going to get that bell on him? Yeah. We're right up against time, so maybe we can look at this very last question, which asks, do you have any sense of what you'll write next? Is this time sparking anything for you, or are you thinking a lot about anything in particular? Maybe that would be a good way to
Do I have any sense of what I write? Yes, I'm writing a book now called Just You Wait. And it's a book about being an older woman in a world that wants to just take out their big gum eraser and just obliterate you. They just don't want to, I'm 65 years old. And yes, I had a facelift. That's why I look even this good. But it doesn't matter how many facelifts you get. You cannot deny your age at 65. Things hurt, you creak, stuff doesn't work. You gotta, it's, and also the book has a lot to do with Jesus as a solution to some of this. And my editor and my publisher and everybody, when I would talk to them about Jesus, they would go, oh, God, no, you can't write about Jesus. You can't write about Jesus. I'm like, there are a lot of people interested in Jesus on the planet. It's not just me. And so when I gave them the first chapter, which begins Beloved and is addressed to Jesus, everybody loved it. And they said, this is great. Like the way you've handled this is really great. I'm like, great. So I'm going to do that every now and then. Oh, no, you can't do any more of it. And I was like, shut up. Y'all write your own damn books. Like, leave my book alone. So it's called Just You Wait. And I think it's supposed to come out in 2022. If I ever stop, watching Andrew Cuomo's briefing about what kind of mask I need to wear.
You have a lot of good masks. I've seen some of your masks in your face
I have
shield.
some good masks. Yeah. I have some good masks. Should we not answer these other questions? I feel obligated to do it. Even if they cut them out?
Yeah, sure.
You gave a commencement address once that was turned into a book. I did. And it says, do you have anything you'd say to people graduating right now? First off, what I would say to people graduating right now is, I'm really sorry, y'all. I mean, you missed the getting drunk with all your friends, and you missed sort of running rampant. And, I graduated into an economy. Well, I didn't graduate, actually. I dropped out. But I finished college, high school, and I dropped out of college, too, in the midst of this boom economy where you could get a job. One could go, especially a white person, one could go and get a damn job. Jobs existed. And so I think it must be very scary for them right now. Mm-hmm. And what I suggested in that commencement address was that you try to get curious. Like if you're afraid you won't be able to get a job, you won't be able to get an apartment, you won't be able ever to get off your parents' couch, you won't be able to start your life. If you can somehow get curious about how you're going to do that, instead of just cowering in the fear, as I always say, I get afraid. I'm always afraid of the wrong things, Like, were you afraid of doing drugs when you did drugs? I was never afraid of that.
No, absolutely not.
Exactly. But when I look back, I was like, why was I doing all those drugs? Like that really cost me, more than a decade of my life.
Yeah.
And who knows how many brain cells. That I'm always afraid of the wrong thing.
Yeah. That's beautifully said.
So getting curious. What do you think of the popular... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think that I read something about how the high school class that's graduating now this semester came into high school as freshmen during the semester that 45 was getting elected. And so to imagine what their high school experience was like, those 4 years for them is just, it's just
so funny when you say 45. When you say 45, I think gun because I grew up in Texas.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's one of those things where like I feel like every time you say his name, like he gets a little flitter of joy, and I feel like I like to strip him of that. You know what I mean? Let's see. Here's a question that says, actually, there are kind of two questions that are kind of orbiting the same idea. What do you think about the popular blurring of genres, which borrow so heavily from memoir tradition, genres like autofiction, creative nonfiction? How do they relate to what you've been doing for so much of your writing career? Those sort of hybrid genres.
So funny. I've always written autobiographically. I think it's all the same. They're just coming up with new names for the same stuff. Philip Roth wrote novels about a character named Philip Roth, who did the things that Philip Roth did. So it's not really new. Since, if you think of, the novel was a radical sort of thing, and it began pretending it was fiction. So I think, in a way, all of modernism, most of what happened in the 20th century in most literary art in English, in the West at least, had to do with blurring of genre, prose poetry, fiction that pretended to be a journal, or an autobiography of some kind. And how did they relate to what I've been doing? I don't think you get to pick whether you write autobiographically or not. I didn't want to write autobiographically because it wasn't cool. I wanted to have a bunch of references like T.S. Eliot and sound like a big smarty pants, even though I was a high school and college dropout. And I grew up in the ringworm belt, and speak redneck, So, there's nothing further from who I am than that. But that was what I thought you had to do to be a poet. So anyway, I think genre blur has been going on, and they're going to now, they call it postmodern now, but it used to be modernist, and before that it was romantic. So
yeah, I think that a lot of the times you kind of just write the thing, and then it's up to the marketing department to figure out how to sell it as like an innovative, brand new thing. And so they come up with these taxonomical designations that don't really correspond one way or the other, positively or negatively, to the thing that you've actually written.
Right.
I think that is all of them.
I think we've done that, right?
Yeah.
Do you consider writing from a particular point of view differently or in the same way when writing memoir versus poetry?
Oh, yeah, I kind of combine that.
Yeah. Poetry's shorter, and I can work on it intermittently, and if I'm working on a big piece of prose, I need a big piece of time. Because if I take off like a weekend from writing when I'm working on a memoir, it will take me like 10 days to 2 weeks to get back to wherever I was. I don't know why that is. It's just, it's words on a page. But the poetry I work on sort of all the time, like the poetry is a lover I'm cheating on my husband with. My husband, the memoir pays the bills. And but it's the poetry I really love.
That's great. That should be the pull quote from this conversation. That's great. That's beautiful. Thank you, Mary. This is brilliant. You were luminous and wise and funny and profane and all the things that we love about you. This was wonderful. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all. We appreciate it. Thank you, City Arts. Thank you, everybody. Now we say poof.